Lioness runs in fear of her own cubs. The shocking reason why. Dr. Margaret Meg Anderson arrived at the Desert Plains Wildlife Center just as the Arizona sun began to peek over the horizon. After 30 years as the center's lead veterinarian, she knew the importance of early morning observations when the animals were most active. Today, she was particularly eager to check on Sahara, their prized African lioness who had given birth to 3 healthy cubs just 2 weeks ago. Morning, Dr. Anderson called Tom Martinez, the night shift keeper, as he prepared to end his watch. You might want to check on Sahara first. She's been acting strange since about 4 a.m.
Meges experienced brow furoved.
Strange how? Well, Tom hesitated, flipping through his observation notes. She's been keeping her distance from the cubs. Every time they approach her to nurse, she backs away. I've never seen anything like it. Meg quickened her pace to the lion enclosure's observation area. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Sahara pacing nervously at the far end of the habitat. The 3 cubs, 2 females and a male, were huddled together near their sleeping den, occasionally mewing for their mother. How long has she been avoiding them? Meg asked, pulling out her tablet to take notes. It started gradually yesterday evening, but it got worse overnight. Watch this. As if on cue, one of the female cubs tottered towards Sahara. The lioness's behavior immediately changed. Instead of welcoming her cub as she had done consistently since their birth, Sahara's ears flattened, and she quickly moved away, showing visible signs of distress. This isn't normal, Meg muttered, noting the lioness's tense posture and rapid breathing. Sahara's been an excellent mother to 2 previous litters. Something's wrong. She pulled out her phone and called Sarah Chun, the center's youngest veterinarian. Sarah, I need you here ASAP. We've got a situation with Sahara. While waiting for Sarah, Meg continued her observations. The pattern was clear now. Every time a cub approached attempting to nurse, Sahara would retreat. Her behavior wasn't aggressive. It was fearful, almost pained. The cubs nursed successfully yesterday morning, Tom added. But by evening feeding time, Sahara started showing the first signs of avoidance. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath. What's going on? Meg pointed to Sahara, who was now huddled in a corner, visibly distressed as her cubs continued their attempts to reach her. Look at her body language. She's not angry or aggressive. She's in pain. Pain. Sarah moved closer to the glass, her fresh veterinary training kicking in. Could it be mastitis? Meg nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. That would explain everything. The sudden onset, the nursing avoidance, the physical distress. We need to get a closer look. But how? Tom asked. Even under normal circumstances, approaching a lioness with cubs is dangerous. If she's in pain, we'll have to sedate her, Meg decided. Those cubs need to feed, and if it is mastitis, Sahara needs immediate treatment. Sarah, call Dr. Patterson and the rest of the medical team. Tom will need the capture team ready in 30 minutes. As her colleagues rushed to make preparations, Meg stayed at the window, her heart aching for both mother and cubs. In all her years working with big cats, she'd seen countless medical issues, but mastitis in a lioness was rare. The inflammation of the mammary glands would make nursing excruciating, forcing Sahara's instinct for self-preservation to override her maternal drive. Hang in there, girl, Meg whispered, watching Sahara's continued distress. We'll figure this out. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the enclosure. Time was critical, newborn cubs needed regular feeding, and Sahara's condition would only worsen without treatment. As Meg heard the capture team assembling behind her, she knew the next few hours would be crucial for both mother and cubs. By 8 a.m., the capture team was assembled outside the lion enclosure. Dr. Patterson, the center's senior veterinary surgeon, joined them with his medical kit. The morning visitors' entrance had been delayed. They couldn't risk any distractions during such a delicate operation. Here's the plan, Meg addressed the team. We'll separate the cubs first. Sarah, you and Jake will handle them. They need immediate feeding with the formula we prepared. Dr. Patterson and I will focus on Sahara. Through the observation window, Sahara had retreated to the farthest corner. Her breathing was labored, and Meg noticed she was avoiding lying down, another telling sign of mammary inflammation. "Look at her teats," Dr. Patterson pointed out. "There's visible swelling, especially on the right side, classic signs of mastitis." The capture team moved into position. With practiced efficiency, they first secured the cubs, using mobile barriers to guide them into a separate holding area. The cubs' hungry cries echoed through the enclosure, making Sahara more agitated, though she still didn't approach them. "Ready with the tranquilizer?" Meg asked, checking the dosage one final time. As the most experienced with Sahara, she would make the shot. "Remember," Dr. Patterson warned, "mastitis can cause fever. We'll need to monitor her temperature carefully under sedation." Meg took careful aim through the delivery port. The dart found its mark cleanly on Sahara's shoulder. The lioness startled, then began pacing more slowly as the sedative took effect. Within 10 minutes, she was safely unconscious. The team moved quickly. They transferred Sahara to the medical facility, where Dr. Patterson began his examination. His gentle but thorough inspection confirmed their suspicions. "Severe mastitis," he announced, showing them the hot, swollen tissue. "The infection's quite advanced. No wonder she was in such pain. Every attempt to nurse would have been excruciating." Sarah returned from settling the cubs with an update. "They're hungry but otherwise healthy. Jake's feeding them now. How's Mom?" "We'll start her on a strong course of antibiotics," Dr. Patterson said, preparing the first injection. "She'll need pain management too. The challenge will be keeping her comfortable enough to allow nursing once the cubs return." Meg watched as they treated Sahara, her mind already working on the recovery plan. They would need to hand-feed the cubs for at least a few days while the antibiotics took effect. But eventually, they needed Sahara to resume nursing. It was crucial for the cubs' development and her own maternal bonding. "We'll need round-the-clock monitoring," Meg decided. "Sarah, can you coordinate the observation shifts? I want detailed notes on both Sahara's condition and the cubs' feeding schedule." As they worked, Meg gently stroked Sahara's head, something she would never dare do while the lioness was awake. "You're going to feel better soon, girl. Then you can be the mother I know you want to be." The medical team spent the next hour treating Sahara, administering antibiotics, cleaning the infected areas, and giving anti-inflammatory medications. They also took blood samples to check for any underlying conditions that might have contributed to the infection. "We'll keep her sedated for a few more hours," Dr. Patterson said, checking Sahara's vitals. "Give the initial treatments time to start working. But we'll need to move her back to the enclosure before she fully wakes up." Meg nodded, then headed to check on the cubs. In the nursery area, Jake was finishing up their feeding. The cubs, with full bellies, were already falling asleep. "They're fighters," Jake said, smiling. "Took to the formula right away." "Good," Meg replied. "They'll need that strength. We've got some challenging days ahead." Looking at the sleeping cubs, Meg felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. They needed to heal Sahara quickly, not just for her sake, but for the cubs who needed their mother. The next few days would be critical for the entire family's survival. The next 3 days tested everyone's endurance at the Desert Plains Wildlife Center. Meg practically lived at the facility, grabbing short naps on the break room couch between monitoring sessions. Sahara's condition required constant attention, while the cubs needed feeding every 4 hours. "Her temperature's finally normalizing," Sarah reported during the morning check. They were observing Sahara through the security cameras as she rested in her indoor enclosure, separated from but within earshot of her cubs. The antibiotics seemed to be working. Meg studied the lioness's behavior on the monitor. Sahara was more alert now, and crucially, she was responding to her cubs' calls. Instead of shrinking away from their sounds, she would move closer to the partition separating them, listening intently. The swellings decreased significantly, Dr. Patterson added, reviewing the latest medical charts. Her last examination showed marked improvement. I think we can try reintroducing the cubs tomorrow. But Meg was concerned about one detail. She still hasn't attempted to lie down on her right side. That tells me she's still experiencing some discomfort. The pain medication should be helping with that, Sarah offered. True, but we need to be certain. A premature reunion could traumatize both mother and cubs if she rejects them again. Meg had seen it happen before with other species. Once a mother associates her young with pain, rebuilding that bond becomes extremely challenging. Throughout the day, they continued their careful monitoring. The cubs, though well-fed by hand, were becoming increasingly vocal about wanting their mother. The youngest female, whom the staff had nicknamed Scout for her adventurous nature, seemed especially persistent in her calls. Late that evening, something changed. Meg was reviewing the footage when she noticed Sahara doing something new. She had started grooming herself, including the previously tender mammary area. "That's what we've been waiting for," Meg told Sarah excitedly. Self-grooming around the affected area means the pain has substantially decreased. She's ready for a test run. They spent the next hour preparing for a controlled reunion. The plan was to introduce just one cub first, Scout, the most vocal one, while keeping careful watch for any signs of distress from Sahara. "Remember," Meg briefed the team, "at the first sign of avoidance behavior, we separate them. We can't risk a setback." The moment of truth came just before midnight. They carefully placed Scout in the enclosure. The cub, suddenly finding herself with her mother, seemed almost surprised. She stood still for a moment, then let out a tiny mew. Sahara's reaction was immediate but measured. She turned toward her cub, ears forward, showing interest rather than fear. Everyone held their breath as Scout took tentative steps toward her mother. "Look at Sahara's body language," Sarah whispered.
No tensión, no retreat.
When Scout finally reached Sahara, the lioness did something that brought tears to Meg's eyes. She lay down on her side, exposing her nursing area. Scout needed no further invitation, quickly latching on to nurse. "Success," Dr. Patterson said softly, watching mother and cub reunite. "But let's give it another 30 minutes before introducing the others." Meg watched the monitors intently, looking for any sign of discomfort from Sahara. But the lioness remained calm, occasionally grooming her nursing cub with gentle licks. "She's ready," Meg decided after the successful trial period. "Bring in the other cubs." The reunion of the complete family was everything they had hoped for. The two remaining cubs rushed to their mother, who welcomed them with open paws and nurturing purrs. All three cubs began nursing, and Sahara showed no signs of her previous distress. "Sometimes I forget why I love this job so much," Sarah said, watching the family bond reform. "Then moments like this happen." Meg smiled, but kept her eyes on the monitors. They weren't out of the woods yet. They would need to continue Sahara's antibiotic treatment and watch for any signs of recurrence. But this was an important milestone. "Schedule a team meeting for tomorrow morning," she told Sarah. "We need to adjust our monitoring protocols and discuss long-term prevention strategies. We can't risk this happening again." As the night shift settled in to watch over the reunited family, Meg finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the past few days. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting for something worthwhile and winning. The next 2 weeks brought significant changes to the Desert Plains Wildlife Center. Meg's team had developed new monitoring protocols, and Sahara's case had become a valuable learning opportunity for the entire staff. During the morning meeting, Meg spread out her documentation across the conference room table. "What we've learned from Sahara could help other facilities prevent similar situations," she explained to the assembled team. "Sarah, would you share your findings?" Sarah stood, pointing to several photographs showing Sahara's recovery progression. The key was early detection. "We now know that subtle behavioral changes, like a mother's reluctance to lie down or showing anxiety before nursing, could indicate mammary health issues. But how do we prevent it from happening in the first place?" Tom asked, thinking about their other big cats. Dr. Patterson stepped in. "We're implementing new preventive measures. daily thermal imaging to detect inflammation early, more frequent health checks during the first month after birth, and we're adjusting our nutritional protocols for nursing mothers. The discussion was interrupted by Jake rushing into the room. "Dr. Anderson, you need to see this." Everyone hurried to the lion enclosure's observation area. Through the glass, they saw something remarkable. Sahara was playing with her cubs for the first time since her illness. She was lying on her back, all 3 cubs climbing over her, and showing no signs of discomfort. "Now that's what I call a full recovery," Meg said, smiling broadly. She watched as Scout, still the most adventurous, pounced on her mother's tail while her siblings wrestled nearby. The team spent the next hour observing and documenting the family's interactions. Sahara's maternal behavior had fully returned. She was attentive, patient, and clearly enjoying her cubs' company. When nursing time came, she positioned herself comfortably, showing no hesitation or signs of pain. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as they watched, "we should write this up as a case study. Other wildlife centers could benefit from our experience."
Meg nodded.
"Already ahead of you, I've been in contact with several other facilities. They're very interested in our handling of the situation, especially our reintroduction protocol." Later that afternoon, during her routine checks, Meg sat at her usual spot near the enclosure, taking notes. The cubs had grown noticeably in the past weeks, their personalities becoming more distinct. Scout remained the leader, always first to try new things. Her sister, whom they'd named Grace, was more cautious but equally playful. The male cub, now called Atlas, was the most attached to Sahara, rarely straying far from his mother's side. "You've done well, old girl," Meg said softly, watching Sahara groom her cubs. The lioness's recovery had been more than just physical. It had strengthened the bond with her cubs. Perhaps, Meg thought, the temporary separation had made their reunion even more precious. Dr. Patterson joined her, carrying the latest lab results. "All clear," he reported. "No signs of infection. Inflammation markers are normal, and her milk production is excellent." "Good," Meg replied, "because those cubs are growing fast. They'll need all the nutrition they can get." As the afternoon wore on, visitors gathered at the viewing area, enchanted by the family scene before them. Meg overheard a young girl asking her mother why the lioness looked so happy. "Because," Meg answered, turning to the child with a warm smile, "she's feeling better now. Sometimes, even lion moms need a doctor's help to take care of their babies." The girl nodded seriously, pressing her hand against the glass as Scout romped past, chasing a leaf. That evening, as Meg prepared to finally head home for a full night's sleep, she made one last stop at the enclosure. Sahara had gathered her cubs for the night, all 3 snuggled against her in their den. The sight brought a sense of completion to their weeks of intensive care. "Tomorrow," she told Sarah, who was preparing for the night shift, "we'll start planning their introduction to the main enclosure. It's time for these little ones to see more of their world." The morning of the cubs' introduction to the main enclosure dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for their big adventure. Meg arrived early, finding Sarah already there, double-checking the safety protocols. "All secure," Sarah reported. "We've added extra padding under the climbing structures and checked every inch of the fencing. The shallow pool is ready too, though I doubt they'll be brave enough for swimming yet." Meg watched as Sahara paced near the connector door, seemingly aware that something new was about to happen. The cubs, now 6 weeks old, were already showing their distinct personalities in how they reacted to their mother's anticipation. "Look at them," Meg pointed out. "Scouts right up front, ready to go. Grace is watching from behind Sahara, and Atlas, well, Atlas is still half asleep." The introduction would be gradual. First, they would open the connecting door, allowing Sahara to inspect the main enclosure while the cubs remained in their familiar space. Only when she was comfortable would they allow the family to venture out together. "Okay," Meg signaled to Tom at the control panel. "Let's open the door." The door slid open smoothly. Sahara approached cautiously, her motherly instincts on full alert. She spent several minutes scenting the threshold before stepping through. The cubs watched intently as their mother disappeared from view. "She's doing a perimeter check," Sarah observed as Sahara methodically explored the space. Classic protective mother behavior. After about 20 minutes of thorough investigation, Sahara returned to the doorway. What happened next surprised even Meg. Instead of leading her cubs out, Sahara lay down at the threshold, creating a bridge between the familiar and the unknown. One by one, the cubs would approach the doorway, touch their mother, then retreat to the safety of their known territory. "Brilliant," Meg murmured. "She's letting them set the pace." Scout, true to form, was the first to venture past her mother. She took 3 bold steps into the new space, then froze, overwhelmed by the vastness. Sahara immediately rose and moved to stand beside her daughter, offering security. Encouraged by their sister's bravery and their mother's presence, Grace and Atlas soon followed. The family group moved slowly into the main enclosure, Sahara constantly checking her cubs' comfort levels. "They're doing great," Sarah said, snapping photos for their records. "Look at Scout. She's already spotted the climbing rocks." Indeed, the adventurous cub was eyeing the low rocky outcropping that had been specially designed for young lions. Sahara, sensing her daughter's interest, led the way, demonstrating how to navigate the gentle slope. The next hour was filled with careful exploration. Grace discovered a patch of tall grass and practiced her stalking skills. Though her technique needed work, her tail stuck straight up in the air, giving away her position. Atlas, finally fully awake, found a fallen log and spent time sharpening his tiny claws, just as he'd seen his mother do. "This is more than just exploration," Meg explained to the gathering staff. "These are their first lessons in being lions. Every new texture under their paws, every different level to climb, every hiding spot they discover. It's all crucial learning." The morning's biggest breakthrough came when Scout, investigating the shallow pool's edge, accidentally splashed her paw in the water. Instead of retreating in fear, she became fascinated by the ripples. Sahara approached, demonstrating how to drink safely from the pool's edge. "Document everything," Meg instructed the team. Their first reactions, how long they spend in each area, their interaction patterns. This will help us design better environments for future cubs. By midday, the cubs were showing signs of fatigue from their morning of exploration. Sahara guided them to a shaded area near the rock formation, close enough to their familiar territory to feel secure, but firmly within their new space. As the cubs settled in for their nap, Meg noticed something remarkable about their positioning. They'd arranged themselves in a way that suggested they'd already marked this new spot as home. Scout and Grace curled together, Atlas tucked against Sahara's side, all of them relaxed despite being in new territory. "That's our sign," Meg said softly to Sarah. "They've accepted this space. The transition is successful." As weeks turned into months, the cubs' growth brought new challenges and delights to the Desert Plains Wildlife Center. Now at 3 months old, they were becoming more independent, testing not only their physical abilities but also their mother's patience. One particularly eventful morning, Meg arrived to find Tom laughing at the observation window. "You've got to see this," he said, pointing to the enclosure's highest platform. Scout had somehow managed to climb to the top of the 15-foot structure, an impressive feat for a cub her age, but now seemed unsure about getting down. Sahara sat at the base, making soft vocalizations that clearly meant, "I told you so," in lion language. "She's been up there for 20 minutes, Tom explained. "Grace and Atlas are just watching from below, probably learning from their sister's mistake." Meg checked the platform's safety features, though she knew they were secure. Sometimes they need to learn these lessons themselves. Watch Sahara. She knows exactly what she's doing. Indeed, the experienced mother wasn't panicking. She maintained her position, occasionally calling to Scout, but otherwise letting her daughter figure things out. After another 10 minutes, Scout finally found her courage and began making her way down, choosing her path carefully. "That's going in the behavior log," Sarah said, joining them with her tablet. "First major climbing milestone, And look, she's using the same route down that Sahara always uses. She's learning through observation. The next challenge came during feeding time. The cubs were now being introduced to small pieces of meat, though they still nursed regularly. Atlas, usually the most reserved, had developed a surprising assertiveness around food. "We need to monitor this," Meg noted, watching Atlas shoulder his way past his sisters to claim the largest piece of meat. "It's normal behavior, but we want to ensure all 3 cubs are getting proper nutrition." Sarah had a suggestion. "We could spread the food out more, give them each their own feeding station?" "Good thinking. Let's set that up for tomorrow's feeding." The afternoon brought another milestone moment. Grace, typically the most cautious, initiated her first solo playstalking sequence. Her target? A large butterfly that had wandered into the enclosure. The staff watched, impressed, as she demonstrated textbook hunting behavior. Low crouch, controlled breathing, and perfectly timed paw movements. "Look at Sahara," Meg pointed out. The lioness was watching her daughter intently, her ears forward, showing approval of Grace's technique. When Grace finally pounced, missing the butterfly but executing a perfect leap, Sahara responded with a congratulatory grunt. "It's amazing how much teaching happens without human intervention," Sarah observed. "Everything they need to know is encoded in their DNA and learned through observation." Later that day, during the cubs' regular health check, Meg noticed something interesting about their social dynamics. While Scout remained the most adventurous and Atlas the most food-motivated, Grace had developed into something of a peacekeeper. When her siblings' play-fighting grew too rough, she would intervene, often diffusing tensions with a playful distraction. "Their personalities are really solidifying," Meg told Dr. Patterson during their weekly review. "We're seeing distinct social roles emerging. It's fascinating how much they mirror wild lion pride dynamics, even in captivity." The day's biggest surprise came during the evening feeding. Atlas, approaching his food station, suddenly stopped and waited. When his sisters arrived, he held back, letting them choose their portions first. "Would you look at that?" Tom said, amazed. "Yesterday's greedy guy is today's gentleman."
Meg smiled.
"That's Sahara's influence. Watch her expression. She's reinforcing this behavior with subtle approval signals. These are the moments that shape their social development." As the sun set, the family settled into their favorite resting spot near the rocks. Scout and Grace were play-fighting lazily, while Atlas was attempting to groom his mother's ear, a bit clumsily, but with obvious affection. "You know," Sarah said, preparing her end-of-day notes, "sometimes I forget these are the same cubs we were so worried about 3 months ago. They've come so far." Meg nodded, thinking about the challenges they'd overcome. "That's what makes this job special. We get to see these transitions, these moments of growth and learning. Tomorrow they'll be a little bigger, a little stronger, a little more independent." "Speaking of tomorrow," Sarah added, "we should prepare for their first public viewing session. Are you sure they're ready?" "We'll start small," Meg assured her. "Short viewing periods, controlled crowds. It's time for them to get used to their admirers. After all, they're going to be ambassadors for their species for years to come." The morning of the cubs' first public viewing brought nervous energy to the Desert Plains Wildlife Center. Meg had arrived before dawn to ensure everything was perfect. The viewing area had been modified with special glass that reduced glare and noise, allowing visitors to observe without disturbing the family. "Remember," Meg briefed her staff, "we're limiting each viewing session to 15 minutes, with 30-minute breaks in between. The moment any of them show signs of stress, we end the session." Sarah had set up a discreet observation post where she could monitor both the lions and the visitors. "I've prepared some basic information cards for the public," she said, showing Meg the laminated sheets. "Simple facts about lion development and conservation." The first group of visitors was small, mostly regular patrons of the center who understood the importance of quiet observation. As they entered the viewing area, Sahara and her cubs were engaged in their morning routine, unaware of their audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Meg addressed the group softly, You're about to witness something special. These cubs represent hope for their species, and we ask that you maintain complete silence during your observation. Through the glass, Scout was demonstrating her latest accomplishment. She had learned to balance on the fallen log while swatting at leaves. Grace was nearby, watching her sister's antics while staying close to Sahara. Atlas, in a show of growing confidence, was practicing his roar, though it came out more as an enthusiastic squeak. A young boy, no more than 7, pressed his nose against the glass. "Why is that one squeaking?" he whispered to Meg. "That's Atlas," Meg explained quietly. "He's practicing his voice. Just like you had to learn to talk, lion cubs have to learn to roar. It takes them about a year to develop their full voice." The visitors watched, entranced, as Sahara began the morning's hunting lesson. She demonstrated the proper stalking position, her belly low to the ground, each paw placement deliberate and silent. The cubs attempted to mimic her with varying degrees of success. "Look at their coordination," Sarah pointed out to an interested couple. "At 3 months, they're developing the muscles and skills they'll need as adults. Every play session is actually a learning opportunity." The first viewing session went smoothly, but the second group proved more challenging. A visitor's camera flash, despite the clear no-flash photography signs, startled the cubs. Atlas immediately ran to Sahara, while Scout and Grace froze in place. "Session over," Meg announced firmly, signaling for the viewing shields to be lowered. She turned to the apologetic photographer. "This is exactly why we have these rules. Their well-being comes first." During the break, Meg watched as Sahara calmed her cubs. The lioness had led them to a more secluded area of the enclosure, giving them time to regain their confidence. Within 20 minutes, they were playing again, though staying closer to their mother than before. "They're resilient," Dr. Patterson observed, joining Meg at the observation post. "But we need to be careful about their stress levels during these public sessions." The afternoon brought better success. The cubs, growing more accustomed to their audience, began to show off. Scout, especially, seemed to enjoy the attention, choosing to perform her acrobatics where visitors could see her best. "She's going to be our little show-off," Sarah laughed, watching Scout demonstrate her climbing skills for the 4th time that day. Grace, while more reserved, had found her own way to interact. She would sit regally near the viewing area, looking for all the world like a miniature queen surveying her subjects. Atlas, having recovered from his morning scare, divided his time between playing and practicing his increasingly impressive squeaky roars. As the day drew to a close, Meg gathered her team for a debriefing. "Overall, I'd say this was a success," she began, "but we need to tighten up our visitor protocols. Sarah, can you draft a more detailed set of viewing guidelines?" "Already on it," Sarah replied. "I'm also putting together an educational presentation about lion cub development. People seem really interested in understanding the learning process." Tom added his observations about the cubs' behavior. "Did you notice how they adapted throughout the day? By the last session, they were completely at ease. Even Sahara seemed more relaxed." Meg nodded, pleased with the progress. "That's what we want to see. These cubs will play a crucial role in educating the public about lion conservation. The more comfortable they are with being observed, the better they can serve as ambassadors for their species." Looking through the observation window one last time, Meg watched as Sahara gathered her cubs for the evening. The family had handled their first day of public life with remarkable grace. Scout was curled up against her mother's side, finally tired after her day of showing off. Grace had draped herself across Sahara's paws, while Atlas was making one last attempt at a mighty roar before settling down to sleep. 6 months had passed since Sahara's health crisis, and the changes in both mother and cubs were remarkable. On this particular morning, Meg stood at her familiar observation post, reflecting on their journey while watching the family's morning routine. Scout, now nearly half her mother's size, was demonstrating her mastery of the climbing structures. Her once awkward scrambles had transformed into graceful, confident movements. Grace had developed into an excellent hunter, her practice sessions with enrichment toys showing promising skill. Atlas, though still the most attached to Sahara, had found his voice. His squeaks had evolved into impressive young roars that echoed through the enclosure. "Remember when we weren't sure they'd make it?" Sarah asked, joining Meg with the morning reports. "Now look at them." Indeed, the transformation was remarkable. Sahara had fully recovered, her coat glossy and her eyes bright with maternal pride. She'd proven to be an exceptional mother, balancing protection with independence as her cubs grew. "We've got some visitors today," Meg said, checking her schedule. "The director from the National Wildlife Conservation Program is coming to observe our protocols. They're considering implementing our maternal care guidelines at other facilities." The morning's highlight came during the cubs' exercise session. All 3 young lions were participating in an enrichment activity, pursuing scented toys that helped develop their hunting skills. What caught everyone's attention was their teamwork. "Look at that coordination," Dr. Patterson remarked, watching the cubs move in formation. "Scout drives the target, Grace flanks left, and Atlas blocks the escape route. That's textbook pride behavior." The visiting director was equally impressed. "Your rehabilitation program has exceeded expectations," she told Meg. "Not only did you save the cubs, but you've maintained their natural instincts. That's crucial for conservation." Later that afternoon, during a quiet moment, Meg sat completing her final case study on the family. She detailed how Sahara's early health crisis had led to improved protocols for maternal care in captive big cats. The cubs' successful development had become a model for other wildlife centers. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, helping Meg organize the documentation. "They'll stay together for another year," Meg explained. "Then, following natural pride patterns, we'll begin planning their transitions. The females will likely remain here as part of our breeding program. Atlas will eventually join another facilities program. We've already had several interested inquiries." As if aware they were being discussed, the family chose that moment to gather near the observation window. Sahara lay regally in the afternoon sun, while her cubs engaged in their usual play. Scout attempted to sneak up on her mother's tail, while Grace watched from her perch on the rocks. Atlas, in a show of growing independence, was practicing his hunting crouch nearby. "You know what makes this case so special?" Meg said, watching the scene. "It's not just about saving 3 cubs. It's about everything we learned in the process. Every challenge we faced helped us develop better ways to care for these amazing animals." The day wound down with a final health check. As Dr. Patterson completed his examination, he shared some exciting news. All 3 cubs are in perfect health. Their development is right on track, and Sahara. He paused, smiling. "Well, she's become something of a celebrity among big cat veterinarians. Her case study has already helped save 2 other lion cubs at different facilities." As the sun set on the Desert Plains Wildlife Center, Meg made her final rounds. The family had settled into their favorite spot, the same area where, months ago, they had first reunited after Sahara's illness. Scout and Grace were nestled against their mother's side, while Atlas lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to survey their domain. "You did it, old girl," Meg said softly to Sahara. The lioness met her gaze with calm confidence, a far cry from the distressed mother she'd been 6 months ago. "You all did it." Sarah appeared with the evening reports. "Should I file these under success stories?" she asked, holding up the cubs' latest developmental charts. "No," Meg replied, watching as Sahara gently groomed her sleeping cubs. "File them under new beginnings, because that's what this was, not just for them, but for all of us. Every challenge taught us something new, made us better at what we do." As darkness fell over the center, the sounds of the night shift taking over echoed softly through the corridors. In their enclosure, Sahara and her cubs slept peacefully, their story a testament to the dedication of those who work to protect and preserve these magnificent creatures. "Tomorrow's another day of learning," Meg said, preparing to leave, "for them and for us."